Evgeniki Isogogi έπρεπε να το κάνετε στα γαλλικά. Πιο εύκολο. So anyway, thank you very much all for coming tonight. Με συγχωρείτε για το καιρό, αλλά πέμπτο εγώ, and είμαι πολύ ευγνώμων που έρθετε. Okay, good. This is an essay which David Lewis and I wrote together, and we've submitted. As with many collective volumes, we kind of wonder what was going to happen to it. And we discovered today that actually they're going to submit the volume. So hopefully it'll be published within the next year and a half or so. So at any rate, this is very much, again, joint work. David and I have been working together on the economy for over 10 years. The other thing is also, I want to thank, and special thanks again to Salini, who is the one who did the PowerPoint for me. She did an excellent job. So I'm very grateful. And also thanks to, again, for the map to Sylvain Fachard, who I think is actually on his way back to Athens right now. Oh, okay, we begin. City and country in the Greek world. Not very long ago, the standard view of the ancient Greek city and its territory was one of a cellular unit whose economic activities were nearly all internally oriented, almost a closed system where exchanges beyond the territory's borders were limited to the importation of a few luxuries for elites and any key commodities, for example, metals, that could not be got locally. Most residents, furthermore, lived in the countryside. The relationship between city residents and country residents was parasitic. The city-dwelling elite drew rents from country dwellers to fund its lifestyle and to provide it with the leisure to pursue politics. This is the Greek city of the new orthodoxy of Moses Finley, and his school was dubbed by Keith Hopkins in 1983. The main tenets of this new orthodoxy were reproduced almost verbatim in the Cambridge Economic History of the Ancient Greek and Roman Worlds, was published in 2007, and they were completely endorsed. I must say, at that time, everything was beginning to change within the field. Finley, of course, recognized that large dynamic commercial cities existed, but he treated these as rarities, and furthermore played down the role of manufacturing even there. Now, recent research into the full range of ancient Greek cities, their territories and their resources, but also crucially their entanglement with the broader interstate trading economy, renders this model completely out of date. This chapter, this talk tonight, I'm going to survey the current state of the subject. Now, due to the constraints of time, comprehensive coverage is, of course, impossible. So we're going to focus on a few case studies. We also limit our time frame to the classical and early Hellenistic periods, and therefore avoid the formative archaic period when processes of urbanization and state formation were still inchoate. Nor do we discuss some of the large urban centers in the Hellenistic Eastern Mediterranean, such as Antioch and Alexandria. This is going to be mainly Eastern Mediterranean. We focus primarily on the Aegean world and secondarily on the colonial world, Magna Graecia and the Black Sea. And the first section aims to canvass the size range of Greek city-states, looking both at overall number of known cities and what the typical city and territory size was. The second section examines agriculture and settlement patterns. The third section looks at uneven resource base of Greek cities, and the fourth shows that many cities surmounted the challenge of small and unpromising territories by specializing in some local advantage, an option that depended on high levels of mobility and interstate trade. The fifth section provides a series of case studies illustrating how cities large and small were integrated into this broader trading economy, but to differing degrees. Okay, the first. In general terms, must make a key distinction between the city as a conurbation, that's the asti, and its surrounding territory, chora. A key point to begin with is that city-states that dominate the historiographical and political record, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, Sparta, were atypically large by contemporary standards. By bringing the average city-state out of the wings and into the limelight has been the task of much recent research. Key studies of those Gerke, jenseits von Athen und Sparta, das dritte Griechenplan, and the essay by Nixon and Price on the size of territories of the cities of the Athenian Empire. Particularly significant, of course, is the work of the Copenhagen Polis Center, whose inventory of archaic and classical polis assembles evidence for 1,035 different polis. The chorus size is known to be to a tolerable degree of precision for about 636 of these. Large cities with territories of about 500 square kilometers account for only 10% of this total. And I've given you these figures on the PowerPoint. 11% had territories of 200 to 500 kilometers. 16% had territories of 100 to 200 square kilometers. 31% had territories of 25 to 100, and 32 had territories of 25 kilometers or less. The average city-state then is rather small. To put it in concrete terms, the border of a city-state with a circular hinterland of 100 square kilometers would lie just 5.6 kilometers from the urban center. 63% of the 636 polis measured by the Copenhagen Center were no bigger than this. Most were smaller. And what is more, the remaining 399 polis whose chorus size is not known mainly come from the bottom of that range, meaning the percentages given above overemphasize how common large cities were. Overemphasize that. Another key finding of the Copenhagen Center concerns the proportion of the population that lived in the cities. By showing that in small cities, the majority dwelled in the urban center, the Copenhagen Center demonstrated that the idea of most Greeks living in the country rather than the city is not warranted. The situation was, of course, different for large cities with extensive territories, but recent work has shown how the size of urban, non-agricultural populations, particularly the commercial and the artisanal sectors, has been greatly underestimated. For example, probably less than half of Attica's inhabitants were farmers. I threw this figure out in an essay I published in 2002. David Lewis, in a recent essay, has, to a certain extent, then confirmed a lot of that. But in a recent essay published in the Cambridge Companion to the Ancient Greek Economy, in an essay by Bresson and also by Sylvain Fachard has drawn on his work to show that to confirm this figure, that given the territory we know in Athens that could be cultivated, it only required 50% or less, perhaps, of the inhabitants to cultivate it and produce agricultural goods. That meant that, in other words, that half of the population in Attica was in non-agricultural labor. Good. Now, agriculture was, of course, the largest sector of the Greek economy, though textile production, largely in the hands of women, may have involved a comparable amount of labor. The agricultural exploitation of a city's hinterland depended on multiple factors. One was residential patterns. In a small city whose territory lay within easy access by foot, most people tended to live in the urban center. Cities with larger territories beyond the reasonable commuting threshold usually had secondary settlements, either villages, farmsteads, or a mixture of two. Now, several decades of intensive landscape survey have greatly clarified these patterns in several regions. The distance between a farmer's residence and a plot or plots of land affected the intensity of exploitation because long commuting times ate into the working day. But furthermore, the transport of agricultural equipment to the field and also the transport of crops to the locus of processing and storage created further potential inefficiencies. But other factors include altitude, rainfall, and access to water, and these are particularly affected the degree to which agricultural production was integrated with animal husbandry, as Christophe Chandazon has shown. Chandazon outlines three major regional types of animal husbandry. The first relates to arid regions of southern Greece, Attica, the Cyclades, and southern Ionia, where cattle were bred only in limited numbers because the water demands could not be met. In these regions, sheep and goats were more common, and their breeding was more closely integrated with arable farming. The second regional type relates to well-watered areas of Greece, that's Thessaly, Boeotia, parts of Crete, and the Peloponnese. Here, the rearing of large cattle herds was more practicable, and sheep and goats were raised in upland pastures. The third type relates to mountainous areas of northern and western Greece with low levels of urbanization in the classical period. That begins to change, of course, in the late classical period and the early Hellenistic period, where land suited for cereals was less plentiful. This terrain was better adapted for large-scale breeding of sheep and goats with limited integration into agriculture. As for arable farming, key crops were barley, wheat, vines, olives, figs, and vegetables. These crops differ in terms of the kind of land best suited to their cultivation, and the highly fragmented and variable Greek landscape lent itself more favorably to one type of crop here, another type of crop there. Now, other factors also include market access. As we shall see, access to markets via local markets, the vast network of interstate markets, could have a profound effect upon land use. The ability to sell at least some of one's produce and to buy what one lacked, not just food, but all sorts of goods, including slave labor, completely altered the calculus of landowners. Now, this is obvious in Attica, for the Athenians imported large amounts of grain when they controlled the seas, but they were forced to expand domestic grain production after losing their hegemony. Now, we're going to examine the effects of markets in the later sections. But first, all cities had marketplace in their urban center. And this, of course, this famous passage, again, of Herodotus. And for most small cities, they would have been just one marketplace, the city agora, near which most people lived. What about cities with large territories? Was it the case that farmers in such regions were isolated from the market by sheer distance between outlying farms and the city itself? Research on this problem is in its infancy, but recent work on deme markets and roads in Attica suggests that farmers were never cut off from the option of marketing some of their surplus. And now, I'm sorry, those who are online, I won't have this map, but for instance, I just want to go to the next slide. It's been assumed that for Attica, for instance, by Robin Osborne in 1987, archaeology knows no markets outside Athens itself, the port of the Piraeus, and Sunion. That there were other places where regular exchange was carried on is not unlikely, but it is significant that they have remained unknown. Even at that time, we knew about several more, and I've given you the list of what archaeology and epigraphy reveal. This is part of a kind of work in progress that Sylvain Fachard and I'm working on, and I've given you the map. And as you can see on this, what Osborne has written is simply not true. There are, again, we have markets attested in Eleusis, Decelea, Rhamnus. Below Rhamnus, we've also discovered one I didn't put on the map, which is at Icaria, and then Gargetos, Erchia in the Mesogaea, and also Halai, Oxymenides, and also then getting down Myrinius and Styria. The interesting thing is about this is that any farmer in Attica would have had a market within probably about 2 or 3 hours walking time. The other thing is that Sylvain has actually showed on the map, which you can see, is he's also traced the road networks. And he's also showed that all these markets, again, are very much linked to the countryside by an elaborate network of roads would have facilitated access. Now, so the idea that most of the population was isolated from market exchange and simply produced food in a closed cycle of domestic economy is therefore completely unrealistic. We must also note that cities with access to the sea often had at least one commercial port or emporion, but even those that did not have access to the sea through networks of roads. For example, Thucydides represents Peloponnesians in the 430s as being linked to the sea and trading their surpluses. The late Yannis Pikolos, unfortunately just passed away recently, he had many pioneering studies of road networks, and he's revealed routes by which even relatively inaccessible regions like Arcadia were integrated into larger cycles of trade. Farmers near the sea could also transport their produce to market by boat, something recommended as early as Hesiod. And finally, when we speak of the city and its countryside, we must not ignore resources other than agricultural land. Key resources include quarries, mines, woodland, and coastal fisheries. The world of Greek cities, therefore, was highly variegated in terms of both the size of city territories and also their resources. Okay. The journey from Athens into Boeotia was sketched by one Hellenistic writer of the 3rd century BCE, a man named Heraclides Criticus, and he provides a useful vignette of the fragmented landscape. His description begins by noting the dryness of Attica, its aging and cramped housing, and the habits of its citizens. He also notes its famous buildings and the agricultural resources. Taking to the road, he guides the reader northwest to Aphidna and Oropos. The latter's position by the sea warrants remarks about its flourishing commerce and rapacious tax collectors. Next, he describes Tanagra, perched on high ground, whose inhabitants were mainly farmers specializing in olives and vines. Tanagran territory had plentiful woodland. And then, when discussing the history of Plataea, he turns to Thebes, remarking its land is flat and rich and dark and well-watered soil that is good for gardens and horse rearing, but lacks woods and is exposed to the wind and flooding in winter. He then proceeds to Anthedon on the coast. This city is small with a shaded marketplace. Its men are mostly fishermen and also work in shipbuilding and ferrying. The younger men fish for purple shells and sponges. The older men work from huts on the seashore. The city has little agricultural land, which is devoted to vineyards. Many of the fishermen own no land at all. And after insulting in quick succession several other Boeotian cities, he crosses the to Euboea and also Chalcis, which lay on hilly ground in a territory that was entirely devoted to olive groves. Heraclides remarks on Chalcis' fortuitous location midway along the Euripus channel. Accordingly, its harbor and marketplace were frequented by many merchants. Now, what Heraclides' account brings out very vividly is a picture of fragmentation and varied resources, but it also brings out a striking amount of regional specialization in production. Instead of viewing their uneven resource bases as liabilities that prevented them from achieving some self-sufficient ideal, the citizens of these cities seem instead to have doubled down on whatever local advantage they possessed. This is in the language of Michael Porter of the Harvard Business School. This is called competitive advantage, which is a big term, which is used again in modern management consulting. But it actually goes back to an idea of, it's a modern version of David Ricardo's idea, which was formulated in 1817 about comparative advantage, and where he talked about it was actually more advantage for different areas to specialize in different, either in goods and services or in special agricultural goods. And that it was much better, actually, in aggregate terms, that one area should specialize in one thing, and another area should specialize in something else, and it was more efficient, therefore, for both of these to kind of trade with each other. But we already see this kind of patterns, actually, again, in antiquity. And so here we see that the inhabitants of Tanagra specialized in wine and olives. The entire hinterland of Chalcis was devoted to olives. Anthedon's limited territory was devoted to vineyards, while most of the men worked at sea. Anthedon is not unusual in this regard. Strabo tells us that the inhabitants of Iasos in Ionia were mostly employed at sea and in fishing, while Pausanias, let me see if I've got this next. Yes. While Pausanias writes that more than half of the inhabitants of Bulis in Phocis worked as fishers of porphyra and the shellfish from which purple dye was extracted. Likewise, Aristotle writes that the demos of several cities had large numbers of seafarers, such as the fishermen of Byzantium and Tarentum, the merchants of Aegina and Chios, the trireme crews at Athens, and the ferrymen at Tenedos. Certain places became famous for particular products, such as the silphium plant from Cyrene, grain and beef from Thessaly, hogs and cheese from Syracuse, dried fruit from Rhodes, mercenaries from Arcadia. This is a famous fragment of Hermippus, which is preserved in Athenaeus, an Athenian comic writer of the 5th century BCE. To make sense of this pattern of regional specialization, however, we've got to look at regional interstate trade. Now, we noted earlier the primitivist model of the economy, where individual cities form cellular units whose economies largely operate as closed systems. On this view, economic activity was hardly affected by what went on beyond the borders. Finley devoted many pages of the ancient economy to arguing that Greek city-states were interested only in imports and not in exports. This is a view, actually, though, goes back to Johannes Hazebrook in a book that was published in 1928. This view now has fallen out of favor, in no small part due to the work of Alain Bresson, whose important work, La Cité Marchande, the Merchant City, addresses Finley's claims about the low level of trade between cities. His chapter on the dynamics of the cities of Lesbos acts as a test case for Finley's claims about cities, their territories, and levels of trade. The island possessed 7 cities. You can see them on the map: Arissos, Antissa, Methymna, Arisbe, Pyrrha, Hera, and Mytilene. I don't know if you can see it on the map, but the thing is where there is the crosshatch shows fertile land, and all the rest is kind of like upland and mountainous areas. So you get an idea of which cities have access to arable land. Ranked by size of their territory from largest to smallest, these were Arisbe, Hera, Mytilene, Pyrrha, Antissa, Arissos, and Methymna. Despite their unpromising territories, Mytilene and Methymna were the most successful and powerful cities. Cities with agricultural land, unprepossessing resources, were therefore able to punch above their weight by engaging in interstate commerce, and they could grow wealthy off harbor taxes. The same point can be made of many cities, particularly Corinth and Aegina, whose engagement in trade led to levels of population and wealth well in excess of what their territories alone could allow. This integration in the interstate trading economy produced a very different pattern of land and labor use than what one would find in each city if they'd aimed at maximizing autarky and isolation. By integrating with larger trade cycles, cities became wealthier themselves, and the wider economy of the city-states benefited from the windfalls of what economists call comparative advantage. That is not to say that all production was oriented towards trade and external markets. Total integration with the interstate trading economy existed nowhere, and in general, integration varied from place to place and from time and across time. What we see among the Greek city-states is a spectrum of integration with these wider trading cycles. Some integrated only slightly, mainly on a regional basis. Transport costs, for instance, tended to orientate trade towards close rather than distant partners. Some specialized in production for longer-term trade, and a few cities acted as hubs for the Aegean trade. These were the wealthiest and most commercially oriented cities. We will now turn to some case studies to illustrate examples from across this range. Okay, good. Our first example is Thassos and the wine trade, and here I'm very much indebted to work of Chavdar Chochev. Thassos was renowned in classical and Hellenistic periods for its wine exports. Excavations had uncovered almost 70 farms from these periods. Although it's difficult to distinguish between farms producing wine and those producing oil, because similar presses were used to process grapes and olives, and similar containers were used to store wine and oil, it appears that many of the farms in the southern part of the island produced wine. Inscriptions provide information about 2 farms producing wine held by Athenian Adamantus in the late 5th century, which may have been calculated to be about 10 and 30 hectares respectively. To export this wine, there were many workshops producing transport amphoras. 40 are attested for the second half of the 4th century, and 16 have been located with half partly excavated. The production of wine was so extensive in the early 5th century that it required regulation. 2 famous laws preserved an inscription. One law forbade the purchase of wine before the harvest. Another made it illegal to import wine between Athos on Mount Athos, yes, and Pachea, and to sell wine in a kotele from amphoras, which probably refers to retail sales. Now, the wine of Thassos was highly esteemed in Athens, as comic sources show. Likewise, in Xenophon's Symposion, the wealthy Callias considers the wine of Thassos a delicacy. At the end of the 4th century, Hippolacus of Macedon described the sumptuous feast at the marriage of the Macedonian Charonos, who served wine from Thassos, Mende, and Lesbos to impress his guests. Archestratus of Gela praises the wine of Thassos as noble, Genaios, if it is old, with the fair seasons of many years. In the days before advertising, the wine of Thasos received numerous endorsements all over the Eastern Mediterranean. It is difficult to identify Thasian amphores before 400 BC, but in the early 4th century, the Thasians began to stamp the handles of their amphores with the name or device of an annual official. These stamps reveal that the wine of Thasos traveled to the eastern and northern shores of the Black Sea, to inland Thrace, to the cities of the northern Aegean, to Rhodes, and to Alexandria in Egypt. Some of the main importers were Athens, 1,000 stamps, Abdera, 670, Amphipolis, 570, Maronia, 85, Doriscus, 200, Pella, about 300, and Kabyle and Zaboryanova, excuse my pronunciation. These are both in inland Thrace. Again, so even in inland Thrace, we've got a good number, and Alexandria about 190. The most numerous exports of wine in the 4th century were the northern Aegean and to the regions around the Black Sea. Of all the stamped amphores found outside Thasos, 64% come from the Black Sea region. This figure rises to 88% for the first 3 quarters of the 4th century, and some of the highest figures are for Pantikapaeum, Phanagoria, Olbia, Istria, Calatis, and Odessa. That not to be confused with the modern Odessa, which was founded by Catherine the Great. These exports from Thasos are not at the disposal of an occasional surpluses, but the result of a steady production for regular sailors abroad. As Tchotchev observes, quote, at Histria, for example, from the beginning of the chronological group F1 to the end of group 8, a period of 75 years, there are only 2 years without Thasian stamps. A similar situation occurs at Calatis, and for an 80-year period between groups 1 and 11, only 5 annual officials are missing. So it's steady. The accuser in his speech against Lacratus indicates that this trade was regular and extensive. Quote, wine is transported to the Black Sea from places around us, from Peparethos, Kos, Thasos, and Mende, and from all sorts of other places. As the passage shows, Thasos was not unique. Many stamped amphoras handles from Mende, Kos, and Peparethos have also been found in this area. Many merchants shipping wine to this area probably returned with cargoes of grain. And according to Demosthenes, half of Athenian grain imports came from this region. Now, wine is not the only product that the Thasians exported in large quantities. The island was also famous for its marble. Most of the quarries around the Mediterranean produced marble made of calcite. The region around Cape Vathi on Thasos, however, produced the mineral dolomite, which produced a distinctive type of marble. Other areas produced dolomite in antiquity, but they were remote and produced marble, which was grayish and fine-grained. The marble of Thasos was unusual for being pure, white, coarse-grained, and dolomite. This made it harder to carve, but less brittle. Now, because Thasian marble was very white, it contained few streaks to distract the eye of viewers. So it's really excellent for sculpture. Marble from Thasos was therefore mostly used for figural sculpture, statues, and reliefs. Very little was used for architecture. I wrote that, but I actually asked Bono Westcote this afternoon, and she corrected me, because you have to distinguish between the marble which is found at Cape Vathi. Cape Vathi on Thasos is on the very northeastern part of the island, and my photograph there is, I don't know if you've ever been there, it's from Aliki, which is on the southeastern part of the island. The marble here is different. It's of a different quality. It's not dolomite. It tends to be softer. And they've now been able to trace some excellent articles by a man named by Herman, working at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, by chemical analyses, has been able to identify the marble coming here again from Aliki, and also as opposed to the marble coming from Vathi. The marble here has been that is coming from again Aliki. It's used in architecture, has been traced in several places again in Asia Minor. So it's for instance at Sardis and in other sites. I think also at Pergamon. So it's traveling a good distance. It's also interesting that the marble that's used on Samothrace for building comes from this quarry. It comes from Aliki. So that one must distinguish again between the two quarries producing different types of marble, which are used for different purposes. Now, much of the marble from Thassos is used locally, but as early as 540 to 520, it's shipped to Macedonia for an Ionic temple at Thermi, which is now modern Thessaloniki. According to Vitruvius, the marble from Thassos was used for the archaic temple of Artemis and Ephesus, and a cornice from the late archaic period is found at Argos, is made from marble from Thassos. In the early classical period, much marble from Thassos was shipped to Italy. Yes, and to make reliefs. The most famous, of course, is the Ludovisi throne, which is now in the Museo Nazionale at Rome, and the Boston throne, which is now at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. A statue of a woman found at Brindisi and a male portrait found at Ostia, dated to the 1st century BCE or the 1st century CE, are made of this dolomite. In the imperial period, dolomite from Cape Vathi continued to be exported to Thessaloniki and throughout the Aegean. It's also popular for use in sarcophagi at Rome. The export of marble then proved to be more long-lasting than the export of wine. Thasian wine exports tend to die out by about the 1st century BCE, but these marble exports continue long into, in fact, they go way down into the late empire, and they're still actually even being used for churches, church at Ephesus, for instance, in the early Christian period. Now, Thassos then provides a useful example of an island with a diverse economy, which nevertheless exploited the advantages of its terroir to great effect, gearing its wine production towards a series of distant markets, as well as taking advantage of the excellence of its local marble. Okay, good. Now, dispersed hinterlands, the formation of colonial networks. Integration into the wider trading economy and the establishment of contacts leading to long-term trading relationships, such as we've seen between Thassos and the Black Sea, could be left to the initiative of merchants. But some city-states, particularly during the Archaic period, established new settlements abroad, which, among other things, created commercial beachheads in regions where some commodity not plentifully available at home could be sought. That's not to say that the so-called colonization movement was simply a matter of trade. Besides, there's a vigorous debate about the degree to which archaic colonies were state enterprises versus private initiatives. Now, without entering into either of these debates, we may note that this phenomenon created new cities across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea with close links to the city or cities from which the settlers came. Therefore, they forged trading networks. Corinthians, for instance, established several cities in the northwest of Greece, stretching as far north as Epidamnus and Alpania, as well as Syracuse in Sicily. This proximity of these settlements to the rich grain sources of Sicily and the Po Valley was no accident. But the most prolific establishers of settlements were the Milesians, whose colonies on the Black Sea were extremely numerous. Earhart has counted more than 40 Milesian, again, colonies. Now, okay. While most Greek city-states were engaged to some degree with broader trade cycles, some more, some less, it was the fortune of certain cities to act as central hub of Aegean trade. In the classical period, this role was filled by the Piraeus, but at one point in the 4th century, we learned that nearly 80% of the ships exiting the Black Sea had the Piraeus as their destination. But even after after losing the Peloponnesian War, the 2% tax on imports and exports at Piraeus was farmed out in 401 BCE for 36 talents, meaning that there was 1,800 talents worth of trade were flowing through the Piraeus for that year. So that's even after the great defeat again in the Peloponnesian War. The international trade picks up again very, very quickly. During the Hellenistic period, Rhodes managed partially to usurp Athens' role as a trading hub, and in particular enjoyed an advantageous location at the juncture of routes leading out of the Aegean to the Eastern Mediterranean. Rhodes thrived on the trade with Egypt. In the 2nd century BC, Rhodes's harbor taxes were farmed out for more than 1 million drachmas, but this sum dwindled to 150,000 after Rome declared Delos a free port. There's a well-known passage in Polybius. This meant that traders could use Delos as a hub without paying harbor fees at all. Delos quickly took over as the focal point of Aegean trade, and Pausanias called Delos the Emporion of Greece. I've given you, again, the passage. And also Pliny noted the island was famous for its temple and also for its commerce. Now, the French school at Athens, again, began excavations in Delos in the late 19th century and has discovered much evidence for commercial and artisanal activity. According to Pavlos Karvanos, an excellent article in Bulletin de Correspondance Hellenique, these excavations have uncovered around 100 domestic buildings and over 300 commercial installations. As Rieger notes, recent estimates have put the adult male population at between 1,800 to 2,100. That's the estimate of Philippe Bruneau, and between 1,200 to 1,500. Claude Vial, I recently sent in Chankowski in her recent book, puts the total number of residents on Delos during the period of independence at 6,000. Now, one must add slaves and medics, which may have added another 20%, but we've got in the entire male workforce, we've got somewhere probably between 2,000 to 2,500. We've no way of calculating the number of free women engaged in work outside the house. But if there are 3 to 5 people working in each workshop, this would mean between 900 to 1,500 were working in non-agricultural labor. One must also take into account the possibility that more workshops may be discovered in future excavations, which would increase this number. These figures can only indicate a range of possibilities, but they suggest that a majority of the workforce was employed in non-agricultural tasks. And all as early as 1976, Claude Vial rightly remarked que les agriculteurs étaient une minorité et les artisans et les correspondants, les commerçants nombreux le fait et certain. In other words, so Athens is not unusual for being a city where you have a large percentage of the people actually being involved in non-agricultural labor. And Delos, the majority are in non-agricultural labor. And then Delos, of course, as a result, had to rely on a great deal of imported grain. Now, Karvanos divides the commercial installations into 2 types, temporary and permanent. The only evidence for temporary shops are holes, either circular or square, for posts dug onto the pavements of streets and market squares. Such structures are well attested in Attica, but several of these holes have been found in the agora of the Kompitalias, but other spaces no doubt accommodated merchants hawking their wares. Now, Karvanos divides buildings used for commercial activity in several types: workshops, shops, multi-purpose rooms, workshops in houses, industrial buildings, and commercial buildings. So we get a large range of different types of, again, buildings, again, for commercial purposes. Buildings that were places of production can be identified by unfinished items, raw materials, waste products, and tools. Sometimes agricultural features aid in identification, such as a circular trench in a stone pavement, revealing the presence of a mill for grain. Warehouses can be identified by the presence of numerous storage amphoras, pithoi, and other containers. Some shops can be identified by their location behind a gallery of a stoa or built into a wall in a row. These rooms are square or rectangular and do not communicate with each other. We find similar examples, for instance, in Thassos, actually, even an earlier period, and of course, one of the more famous examples, of course, in the agora of Pella of about 300 BC and later. Now, others are placed along streets, at crossroads, along agoras, next to sanctuaries, and alongside the docks of ports. The presence of measuring instruments like weights and psychomata and numerous coins are also indications of commercial activity. In some cases, rooms used for production are found around courtyards and buildings. Most are dated to the 2nd and the 1st centuries BCE, but some go back to the 3rd century BCE. Now, workshops have been identified for the production of food, such as mills for grinding wheat and presses for making olive oil. But other workshops have been identified as producing clothing, making ceramic items, stoneworking, metalworking, glassmaking, and the production of musical instruments. There's also much evidence for craft production in the records of the hieropoioi of the sanctuary of Apollo, studied by Fayel and also recently by Veronique Chankowski. They kept detailed records of their payments for various goods and services. Fayel has analyzed these records and found that over 700 individuals selling various items are performing a variety of services. Different craftsmen Retailers sold nails, lead, pitch, wood, bricks, tiles, torches, lead, rope, purple dye, and perfume. And there are many different types of craftsmen hired to carry out construction, repairs, and other tasks. Stoneworkers, gilders, woodworkers, metalworkers, sculptors, painters, men whitewashing buildings, and men carving stele, and a female baker. And actually, there's a very good section. It's interesting in a very useful work by Deona on the private La Vie Privée du Daros, which has an excellent section of about 50 pages, actually talking about the different types of occupations, which shows again that Athens is not unusual in having a high degree of specialization of labor. Now, again, but there's although the sanctuaries create a large demand for goods and services, there is no reason to believe that these craftsmen and retailers worked exclusively for the hieropoi. And I don't think that most of the demand is coming from the temple. It's very clear that in a population of 6,000 people, a lot of demand is generated. In fact, the vast majority of demand is being created by domestic consumption. And this, I think, is also very well illustrated by Deona's study. Again, for instance, Delos was famous for the manufacture of perfume, which was clearly aimed at an export market. One perfumery has been securely identified, and numerous presses and troughs have been discovered which could have been used to produce perfume. The records of dedications made to sanctuaries also attest the presence of many artisans in metalworking and the carving of precious stones. And yes, now Clarice Pretre, very valuable book, has collected and analyzed the different names for jewelry dedicated and found roughly 300 different descriptions. There are roughly 110 different names for rings made out of silver, gold, iron, and precious stones. And there are also 30 different types of earrings or pendants, enotion and enodion. There are also small boxes, necklaces, bracelets, and other items. Now, all of these would have required much skilled labor. Again, and some of the dedications were bought by pilgrims from abroad, but the largest proportion was made by the people of Delos. This is 193 out of 489, and the largest number of collective dedications were made by the people of Delos. So you can't explain all these items in the hieropoia as things brought from abroad. They're obviously, in most cases, very useful tables, actually, in Christy Konstantopoulos' book, on which I'm relying on here, again, for the numbers. Again, most of these dedications are made by locals, and obviously they've been bought locally. And again, as I've given you Christie's numbers, these dedications therefore reflect the activity of skilled artisans, again, on the island. And to give you some example of these beautiful earrings from Delos, and another example, this is from Clarice Pretre's book, and also those. And what's interesting is these, again, are found in domestic contexts. There's not, so they're obviously, again, produced for domestic consumption. Now, another type of commercial activity was extensive enough to provide tax revenue was the harvesting of murex to produce dyes. During the period of independence, this tax is mentioned in over 20 texts, and several mention where murex was collected, near Phoenix, around the isthmus, and in front of Delos. 3 texts of the hieropoii mention purchases of purple dye, and one of which is a price of 100 drachmas for 1 mina. Another mentions Pyrrhus, who worked with purple dyes. And here, again, you have an example, again, from one of the, I think it's from Bruno, of just the shells, again, which have been discarded, which give you an idea of the kind of volume, actually, of this production. In fact, remains of murex shells have been found in 5 different buildings. Evidence for production of purple dye in the late 2nd century or early 1st century BC, such as blocks for smashing the shells and vats for collecting, has also been found in 3 trenches near the eastern shore of the island. So once more, again, I think this is all, again, for domestic consumption, if not actually for export. The case of Delos then shows an example of a Greek city at the extreme end of the spectrum of commercial integration. But what about the small, politically and economically insignificant cities earlier, which the Copenhagen Center has shown to have been extremely common? This is a small city near Teos. One of Finley's rather deft moves in the ancient economy was to accept the existence of large trading cities and commercial hubs like Delos, but simply to dismiss them as exceptions to the norm of closed agriculturally based cities that traded little out with the outside world. The study of the economies of small cities, therefore, provides a vital corrective to this view. In the Politics, Aristotle praises the community which is large enough so that it can provide for all its needs, but writes that the community consisting of a few people, exalogon, cannot be self-sufficient, autarkes. This implies that a small community must import those products that it lacks and export products to pay for those imports. Even though small cities do not have the power to extract taxes and tribute from their neighbors, they did not remain isolated in commercial terms. We've already seen that this in the case of Anthedon in Boeotia. An inscription provides another key example. This inscription is dated to the late 4th century BCE, and was found in Austin. Provides a glimpse into the exports and imports of a small community absorbed into the territory of Teos in Asia Minor. The name of the city, located in the modern Turkish village of Ulamis, is not preserved, but was clearly located near the fine spot of the inscription in a heavily wooded area, very different from the rich agricultural plain of Teos. The inscription contains a list of exemptions from taxes and duties granted by Teos to the community, and therefore gives information about its exports and imports. It is subject to a very useful article, again, by Christophe Chandezon, on whom I'm very much relying here. The new citizens are given an exemption from taxes on pack animals and slaves, and from taxes on the sale of timber and on sheep. There also appear to have been exemption from the sale of charcoal. Another exemption is on the sale of cloaks made from Milesian wool, whether rough or fine, either for local sale or for export. To make these cloaks, the citizens have imported purple dye from abroad and now receive an exemption from duties for this material. Finally, the decree mentions the gardens and beehives and an exemption from duties if they wish to export. Even though small, this community had some economic diversity and was not completely reliant on agriculture and arboriculture. The abundant resources by the forest are exported for wood and to produce charcoal. The sheep provide wool for fine clothing, even though the purple dye has to be imported from abroad. The produce from gardens and from beehives was also not simply for home consumption, but was exported. The production of this surplus was clearly supported by slave labor, which was extensive enough to be subject to taxes. Now, this inscription confirms Aristotle's insight. Small cities had neither the extensive territory in which most vital resources could be found, nor the military clout to seize resources and intimidate neighbors that did have them into directing them toward themselves. Accordingly, deep engagement with the Aegean trading economy was simply a matter of a necessity for these small cities. Now, the closed city-state. Not all Greek cities engaged vigorously with the interdependent city-state economy sketched above. Some stood comparatively aloof. Two conservative examples are particularly noteworthy: Sparta, which before 370-69 also dominated Messenia, and Crete. In these regions, small citizen bodies lived parasitically off mainly agrarian slave populations, and the avenues for conspicuous consumption were narrower than in the more commercial cities. In its heyday, Sparta controlled a huge territory comprising Laconia and Messenia, about 8,500 square kilometers, divided by the Taygetus mountain range. This territory contained most of the resources that the Spartan citizenry needed, apart from copper and tin. Sparta's conservatism was reflected in its economy, which was mainly inward-looking, at least as far as the citizenry was concerned. Usually for a city of its size and importance, Sparta did not mint its own silver currency until the Hellenistic period, and in general, it remained seriously under-monetized and engaged minimally in foreign trade. Sparta's citizens lived parasitically off its helot or slave population, which was replaced without engagement with foreign trade. Still, Sparta did possess a large marketplace catering for regional exchange. This is one of my favorite passages from Xenophon's Hellenica. One can find no reference to this passage in Moses Finley's Ancient Economy. No surprise. I don't think you can also find it in the Cambridge Economic History of ancient Greece and Rome. Though the Periokic polis of Goronthrai in southern Laconia may have been the main trading hub of the region. Classical Crete, on the other hand, contained around 50 cities. Most were independent, though some dependents of larger neighbors. Like Sparta, Crete was politically and economically a conservative region. Citizens were restricted from engaging in conspicuous consumption, and as at Sparta, there was a mandatory citizen upbringing oriented towards warfare. There were craftsmen in the Cretan cities, though most seem to have been non-citizens, and the Cretans did engage in some foreign trade, though on a limited scale. We may come back to that in the question period. It gets different in the late Hellenistic period. The Cretan cities, however, did mint coinage from the 5th century onwards. Now, these cities and their limited commercial links to the outside world attracted the interest of philosophers such as Plato, who seem to have been in part inspired by them when sketching out their ideal cities. In the Republic and the Law, Plato seeks to find a middle route for his cities, where the advantages of specialization of labor and limited trade are harnessed without progressing to the point where all citizens are engaged in a headlong pursuit of money, leading to luxury, strife, and again, expansionism, problems that Plato witnessed firsthand at Athens. In the Laws, Plato locates his city 80 stays from the sea in a territory with as many possible of the resources necessary for life. I've given you the passage. To balance the needs of the city for resources with the threat to citizen virtue posed by extreme integration with the interstate trading economy. Now, again, in the preface to his Trade and Politics in Ancient Greece, a book that exercised a major influence on Finley, Johannes Haserbrook argued that close attention to the evidence for the Greek economy would show that Plato's ideal states were less utopian, less divorced from contemporary fact than his rivals claimed. In other words, Haserbrook thinks that this passage, again, from Plato's Laws actually represents a reality. The past several decades of work incorporating a wide range of archaeological, numismatic, and epigraphical evidence has shown that this is quite the opposite. Most cities in the ancient Greek world were well integrated into the interstate economy, particularly the small states that Finley insisted were the most isolated from commerce. Our increasingly granular knowledge of the production, labor, and trade of the city-states shows how radical and reactionary Plato's ideal cities were. Thank you very much.